So, I'm going to bring you back to Earth just for a moment.
Oh, shucks.
And I want to start with a question about your title. You have the coolest title at Google. Vint's title at Google is Chief Internet Evangelist. What does that mean?
So where did that come from? So actually, it sort of means whatever the heck we decide it means. It means, you know, whatever I think I need to do now. It seems like it would fit under this very broad rubric. I didn't ask for that title. You know, the title I asked for when I joined Google, they said, what title do you want? I said, Archduke. And Larry and Eric and Sergey went away, and they came back, and they said, well, do you remember that the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914 and started World War I, and maybe that's a bad title to have. So why don't you be our chief internet evangelist? And I said, okay, I think I can do that. However, it is a misunderstood title. So a couple of years ago, I'm in Moscow, and I'm lecturing in public. And at the end of 4 of the lectures, I was asked point blank in public, do you believe in God? And I remember thinking, boy, that's a personal question to ask somebody in public. And I thought about it some more, and my response was, well, let me explain. I'm geek orthodox. And they seemed to like that. It was okay. So I'm now the geek orthodox chief internet evangelist at Google. So that's where that title comes from.
Yeah, geek orthodox, not Greek orthodox.
Geek
okay.
orthodox.
Good. So I got that one right. You don't only have the coolest title, you're also by far the most well-dressed. I don't know anyone at Google that actually wears a suit, and definitely not a three-piece suit. So what's that about?
What's with the three-piece suit? Actually, I think Nikesh Arora might be found from time to time in a three-piece suit.
He's still trailing behind.
So look, forever, since I can remember, I always didn't want to look like everybody else. So when I was in high school, I wore a sports coat, a tie, and slacks, and I carried a briefcase, except when I was wearing a ROTC uniform. When I was asked to move to Washington from Stanford University to run the internet program for the Defense Department, my wife said, Washington, D.C., three-piece suits. So we ran off to Saks, Fifth Avenue. We bought 3 three-piece suits to take to Washington. My first task, among my first tasks, when I was at ARPA, was to appear at a briefing over in the Congress. And it was in the middle of the summer, and you know what Washington summers are like, all hot and muggy. So I had a seersucker, one of those striped, very lightweight three-piece suits. So I wore that. And after I returned from my exposure to the members of Congress, I was called up to the director's office. And he said, the briefing went very well. And by the way, they sent a note saying you were the snappiest dresser they've ever seen from ARPA. So this reinforced my belief that wearing three-piece suits was a good idea, and I've worn these things for 37 years since.
Okay, keep it up, Vint, because you're giving us an inspiration.
They're starting to come back, by the way. I'm beginning to see a few more people showing up in three-piece suits.
Okay, on a more serious note, internet is probably the most important invention, at least to my mind, in the past 50 years. How does it feel to have such a huge impact on people's lives? Do you wake up every morning saying, wow, this is my creation?
No, I don't really feel that way. How many of you people have children? Almost everybody in the room, maybe. Okay. Do you understand that it's really, you learn very quickly as a parent not to take too much credit when your kids do well, so you don't have to take too much blame when they screw up? So, first of all, I'm not the only father of the internet. Bob Kahn and I started this work together in 1973, 2 hands on 1 pencil. And since that time, literally hundreds of thousands to millions of people have contributed to the net. So it's the thing that I take the most pleasure in, to be honest with you, is that this design has turned out to be so receptive to new ideas and new technology. I remember Bob and I thought about 2 very specific things that I think have served very well over the last 40 years of conception and 30 years of operation. The first one was that the internet protocols, the things that allow data to move from machine to machine and network to network, are completely insensitive and unaware of the underlying transmission medium over which the data moves. This is not too different than a postcard. So if you think for a minute about what you know about postcards, you know that they aren't aware whether they are going on a truck or a bicycle or an airplane or a boat or being carried on a motorcycle or something. The postcards are ignorant of how they're being carried, and the internet packets are similarly ignorant. The second thing, which is almost more important, is that just like a postcard doesn't know what's written on it, the internet packets don't know what they're carrying. And there is a profound consequence of this ignorance. In fact, somebody, David Eisenberg, wrote a wonderful article called "The Rise of the Stupid Network," because it doesn't know what's going on. All it knows is it's moving these little packets of bits around. So the important part about the network not knowing what the packets are carrying is that when you want to invent a new application, you don't have to change the network. The network just keeps moving packets. It's the interpretation of the bits that's so important. So when packetized voice and packetized video and packetized programming or interactive games and all these other things were developed, you didn't have to change the network at all because it was only at the edges of the net that you had to interpret. So this is an example. The second thing that was pretty important, we thought pretty hard at the beginning, should we patent this or do anything to provide intellectual property protections for it? And because we wanted it to become internationally accessible and useful, we wanted people to just build pieces of the internet and connect them together. We decided to put no constraints at all on the design, the detailed specifications, and everything else, and on the presumption that we would remove any barrier and excuse for not trying it out or using it. Now, looking back over 30 or 40 years, I'm a little astonished that we got away with this because it's in the middle of the Cold War. We're working for the Defense Department, and we're releasing the details of the design of this system. And the only reason I think we got away with it is that we didn't ask permission and nobody noticed. It was just this geeky research project. But it was enough eventually to persuade people that they should use this. There were competitors. And there were a lot of alphabet soup, Frame Relay, X25, OSI, and so on. The competitors were usually proprietary, and some of them we just ran internet over. Like some people thought that asynchronous transfer mode, buzzword for high-speed communication, would somehow replace TCP/IP, but instead we just ran all the protocols on top. And again, this is a function of the protocols not caring how they were being transported underneath. So we actually got a few things right in there. We also created institutions that were extremely open and participatory and multi-stakeholder. So the standards that were made for the internet came out of something called the Internet Engineering Task Force. It's a voluntary collection of people. You can't join it. There's no place to become a member. All you can do is show up. You remember Woody Allen said 80% of life is showing up. Well, it's certainly true at IETF. You show up, and if your ideas are good and people like them, they'll get implemented, and if they don't like them, they won't, and that's it. It's a meritocracy. In fact, David Clark, who used to be the chairman of the Internet Architecture Board, coined an expression, rough consensus and running code. And that's what makes the IETF go. That's what makes the internet go. People do things to make it work, and it's only if it works do you standardize it, as opposed to the other way around.
Vint, did you expect back then that the internet will evolve to what it is today? Is that possible?
Well, one answer, of course, simple one would be no. Another answer that Bob Kahn likes to give is absolutely, we knew everything that was going to happen. In fact, let's see, in the next 10 minutes, so the more honest answer is that we didn't know everything that was going to happen. I'm not sure that we would have predicted mobiles, although, or smartphones, I should say, although we had 4 years of exposure to a predecessor system called the ARPANET, which was built for the Advanced Research Projects Agency, not for military purposes, but to allow the academic community to share their computing resources and their software. At that time, ARPA was funding about a dozen universities to do research in computer science and artificial intelligence. And every single university, like Carnegie Mellon and Stanford University and MIT and so on, kept saying to ARPA, please buy a world-class computer for us every year. And even ARPA couldn't afford to do that. So they said, we're going to build a network and you're going to have to share. So we did build the ARPANET, and they did share their software and their computing power. But some of the applications were pretty stunning. By 1971, electronic mail gets invented on the ARPANET. And it was almost, not an accident exactly, but it was a kind of an interesting little step. A guy named Ray Tomlinson noticed that if you had these two time-sharing machines that were connected to each other on the ARPANET, that you could send a file from one to the other and then leave it for somebody else to pick up, sort of like a mail drop. And he said, okay, so let me see, how do I distinguish between the name of the computer that I want to send the data to and the name of the mailbox that it should be put in? And he looked for a separator to do that, and he noticed that one of the characters on the keyboard that hadn't already been used for something else was the @ sign. And that seemed like a really natural thing, user at host. So that's what he used for distinguishing the mailbox name, the username, and the host name. So that's why the @ sign is part of your email today. So that got invented in 1971. And what's interesting is that very, very quickly we realized what a powerful social invention this was. Distribution lists got created within a couple of weeks of email becoming popular in our ARPANET community. The first distribution list was called Sci-Fi Lovers. It was all about science fiction books. And look, we're a bunch of geeks, we all read science fiction, and everybody had opinions about different authors. So that was what that distribution list was about. The second one was called Yum Yum, and it was a restaurant evaluation distribution list for restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area, and eventually that got bigger. So we became very aware that this was a social, this system had a very powerful potential for social networking. Without going into a huge amount of detail, we also saw the work of Douglas Engelbart at SRI International, who invented something called the online system, which for all practical purposes was a one-computer World Wide Web. He invented the notion of hyperlinking. He invented the mouse to point to things on the screen. You could click on a reference to another paper and have it go to that paper and pull it up on the screen. It was an incredibly elaborate system, and we were using that. And possibly even more compelling about what we realized was possible is that Xerox Palo Alto Research Center was literally 1.5 miles from my laboratory at Stanford University. In 1973, when Bob Kahn and I started the design of the internet, Bob Metcalf was inventing the Ethernet at Xerox PARC. These guys had been part of the ARPA community. They were brought by Xerox PARC to Palo Alto. They were given almost carte blanche to invent anything that they would find interesting. So the first thing they did was this Ethernet. That was Bob Metcalf. Then the next thing they did was invent a personal computer. It was called the Alto machine, and it only cost $50,000 each in 1972 or 73. 250 people had the personal computers there in 1972 or 73, and this fast Ethernet. So they did a text processing program called Bravo. The guy that did that eventually went to Microsoft and did Microsoft Word, in fact. They were operating 20 years in the future with what you see is what you get, editing, all kinds of real-time applications and interactions. And so that was all part of the environment that Bob and I were working in at the time we were doing the internet design. So I would say, to answer your question, that although we didn't see everything that was going to happen, we saw the potential of what was possible using computing, especially as it became a personal tool. One other little note, if you don't mind. There are certain dates in this whole series have become really amazing for me. In 1973 and 1983 are two particularly important dates. For Bobcon and me, 73 is when we did the first design. We published a paper the next year. It turns out that a guy named Marty Cooper invented the handheld mobile in 1973. Of course, none of us heard about it until 10 years later in 1983, which is when we turned the internet on January 1st, 1983, and Marty turned on the handheld mobile in that same year. And one of my Israeli friends, Danny Cohen, invited me to lunch one day in 1983, and he said, I have something to show you. And I came down to lunch with him, and he had this thing sitting on the table. It was a Motorola handheld mobile phone that weighed 3.5 pounds with a whip antenna, so it took about this tall. And the battery only lasted for 20 minutes. But Marty Cooper said that was okay because you couldn't hold it up for longer than that anyway. So I asked a bunch of questions of Danny, and Danny said, I don't know all the answers. Why don't you call Marty and ask him? So we called Marty on his phone, and I learned a little bit more about how it worked. Now, the wonderful thing about all this is that just in September of this year, I had the pleasure of awarding the Marconi Prize to Marty Cooper for inventing the handheld mobile. And we did it at the Villa Grifone, which is where Marconi did his original research in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So we had a picture of Marty sitting in Marconi's chair, with his handheld mobile. So that's the kind of the context in which a lot of this stuff evolved. So honestly, I think we had a real sense of the power of the system, even if we didn't know all the details of what was going to happen. Can I tell you what surprised me more than anything?
Go ahead, of course.
This I was totally had not anticipated at all. Even though we knew about this sort of World Wide Webby design of Douglas Engelbart's and all of his wonderful vision and aspirations, what surprised me is when Tim Berners-Lee released his version of the World Wide Web in the end of '91, and by the way, nobody noticed when he did that. But a year later, Mark Andreessen at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications developed the graphical version of this, Mosaic browser. It absolutely took the net by storm. It was downloaded 1 million times in the first couple of weeks because suddenly the internet became colorful. It looked like a magazine. You had text, you had imagery. Eventually you had streaming video and audio and so on. It was just an amazing transformation. But that wasn't what surprised me. What surprised me is once the web was out there, once people had access to this software, the amount of information that people poured into the net for the sheer joy of knowing it might be useful to somebody else was frankly astonishing. I've never seen anything like it. They put their information out there not for pecuniary reasons, but for the simple reason that it might be useful to someone. And of course, they often got good feedback saying, thank you very much, I was able to use your information. So this avalanche continued over time, and eventually nobody could find anything until things like Alta Vista and Yahoo and Google and other search engines finally emerged in order to make sense out of this enormous avalanche of content.
Amazing summary of the history of the internet. I think we missed in '93 Netscape, which kind of took this.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, that's quite right. In '93, the commercialization of that browser by Jim Clark, who hired Mark Andreessen and brought him to the West Coast. The big trigger for the dot boom was Netscape Communications IPO in 1995. And at that point, every venture capitalist in California, or at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, was pouring money at anybody who had any idea that their company might have something to do with the internet. Now, I know that there are some entrepreneurs in here. I know there are some seasoned CEOs and even some financial experts. This was crazy, right? Billions of dollars got thrown at these companies. And the young entrepreneurs would take the money and they would spend it without understanding the difference between capital and revenue. So when they ran out, they didn't understand what happened. Of course, the answer is, if you don't make more money than you spend, eventually it's a bad business model. So the venture capital guys eventually figured out this wasn't working for a lot of them, and the dot bust happens. All the money dries up, companies finally fail. But the internet continues to grow, and it has continued to this very day, continuing to expand. New ways of accessing it, smartphones being the most recent.
Vint, you mentioned when you started off Moonshot Thinking, which is kind of what Larry, our CEO, likes to talk about when he thinks about a real disruptive technology that's going to impact billions of people that sounds today like science fiction, but actually has robust technological foundation to the idea, right? And I was wondering, is this something, this kind of idea of moonshot thinking, is this something that is preserved only for big companies with a lot of cash, or can you find that kind of thinking in other places?
Well, first of all, my view is that the internet in general is a place where anyone with a new idea has a fair shot at trying it out. What's amazing about the internet's business model is, well, there's several interesting things about it. The first one is it's not like the telephone model. In the telephone model, when you make a phone call, you have to pay for everybody in between. In the internet model, you pay an ISP to get access to the internet, and that's it. Both ends have made that payment. The ISPs figure out how to interconnect with each other on whatever basis they want to. Sometimes it's for pay, sometimes it's just a free exchange, depending on what benefit each of them believes they're getting from the other ISP. And then the users proceed to do whatever they want to do on the net. So this is a very different business model. You don't have to go around doing business deals or contracts with every single internet service provider in the world in order to make use of the internet. You just have to do a deal with one of them, the access guy. Same is true for bringing up servers. The second thing that's interesting is that a lot of the infrastructure of the network you don't have to pay for. I mean, Google is a good example of that. We provide all these platforms and underlying support systems, whether it's hosting or Blogger or the Google Earth or Google Maps. We pay for that. The users get access to it to build potentially products and businesses on top of it. So it's a very distributed cost model, which is different from the classic situation where you end up having to pay for all of the infrastructure that you need in order to run the business, which suggests to me that there's much more open opportunity for new ideas to spread, for people to take risk and try things out, because the barrier to entry into trying a new idea out is much lower than it is in the conventional world. So small companies get an equal shot. In fact, if anything, the smaller ones do better than the big ones, because the big ones have the innovator's dilemma problem, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with.
So you're saying the internet is playing the level field, which gives a moonshot opportunity for entrepreneurs and for new businesses, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of entrepreneurs in this room and a lot of business leaders. What does all this mean for businesses?
Well, I hope it means several things. First of all, it means that businesses that have an interest in being visible pretty much anywhere in the world, in any market, have an opportunity to use the internet as a way of projecting visibility to their products and services essentially anywhere. If it happens to be that your business is able to deliver the content or whatever the product through the network, then you have an opportunity to actually use the internet as your primary means of delivering the product that you're interested in. I think it's been very interesting to watch Amazon, for instance, starting out with this audacious idea that it could be the world's biggest bookstore. And now, many years later, it's finding that over half of all the books that it delivers are in digital form, not in printed form. And so now they've taken the internet and used it not only to advertise and to get orders and to manage customer interaction, but also to deliver product. And I'm convinced that there are opportunities like that awaiting virtually any big or small business that has access to this system.
Okay, let's talk about another crazy expression I heard from you in the past 2 days, cyborgs. So this kind of Homo sapien, if you want, version 2, which human beings have technology parts in their bodies, right? By the way, I just read a week ago that someone planted a kind of cyborg in his arm, something that communicates with his Android device. It looks kind of ugly. You can really see that the stitches and, you know, the whole thing in his arm. Is this real? Is this really going to happen? Are we going to be made out of technology? You won't be able to differentiate between the technology, the human being?
Well, I have to admit,
how much of this is science fiction, or is it real stuff?
There's a certain yuck factor to this, isn't there? Well, let me give you an example of the interfacing of computer-type gear or digital information, digital systems into our neural systems. This is a story about my wife who was born with normal hearing and then lost her hearing when she was 3 years old. And she was deaf for 50 years after that. The only way she could communicate was to read people's lips. She had more or less normal speech, which is amazing, but it's because she had acquired speech by the time she was 3 and didn't lose it. At age 53, 50 years later, in 1996, she learned about the cochlear implant by crawling around on the World Wide Web, even that long ago, and went to Johns Hopkins to be tested for whether an implant would work. You understand how this works. The cochlea is where the auditory nerve is, and it's all rolled up like a little snail shell. When sound goes into the outer ear, it moves an eardrum, and then there's an inner ear, or inner eardrum, which moves, and it moves liquid inside the cochlea. And there are little ciliary hairs of varying length. And the little short ones resonate with high frequency, and the long ones resonate with lower frequency. And they're organized that way from high to low in this auditory nerve that's curled up. So the way a cochlear implant works is that it takes about a 45-minute operation. You snake a sequence of something like anywhere from 16 to 20 electrodes are slid into and touch the auditory nerve. It comes to rest. There are some electronics that are also embedded just below the skin. And then you sew all that up, and it takes about 3 weeks to heal. So that's the implant part. There's a device called a speech processor which communicates with the electronics in the cochlear implant. The speech processor takes sound in from a microphone, analyzes the frequencies that are present, figures out what their amplitudes are, then it figures out which of the electrodes that are touching the auditory nerve should be electrically stimulated in order to fool the brain into thinking that the ear is working again, instead of the little ciliary hairs moving to generate the neural signals. So about 20 minutes after she returned to be activated, she picked up the phone and called me for the first time in our 30 years of marriage. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was a pretty amazing thing to be able to talk to my wife on the phone. By the time I got home, I discovered I had a 50-year-old teenager at home. I couldn't get her off the telephone. Marketers would call and she would chat for half an hour. Hello, where are you? Oh, you're in India? Which part of India are you? I would go on and on. Then she decided she wanted to listen to books she wanted to listen to books for the blind so she could hear words that she hadn't heard before. She knew what they were because she could read them, but she didn't know what they sounded like. So she calls up the library and they say, yes, we have recorded books for the blind. What's your name and address and phone number? And then they say, now, you're blind, aren't you? And she says, no, I'm deaf. And there's this long pause. And they're trying to figure out, well, how is this going to work? So she listened to 500 books on tape. She's got patch cords, so when we go on an airplane, she patches the auxiliary telephone input, or the auxiliary microphone input in the speech processor to the little jack in the armrest, so the only sound she can hear is coming from the movie, not the screaming kid that's 2 seats over. She has an FM transmitter receiver. So if she were in this situation, I would be having a little transmitter hanging around my neck. She would be sitting anywhere in the room receiving the FM signal, and then that goes into the speech processor. She has an optical detector which she can use in the theaters to listen to the soundtrack. Her favorite trick is to excuse herself to go to the ladies' room at a dinner party and leave the transmitter on the table. So when she's away in the ladies' room, she's tracking the conversation. So we have to tell everybody, don't say anything you don't want Sigrid to hear. You never know where there might be a microphone. This is so transforming that I had to buy a bigger house because in the years when she was still deaf, she could lip read maybe 4 people for dinner, and that was hard work. Now she could hear. I had to buy a bigger house because she wanted to have big parties because she could hear. So, well, we moved to a nicer house. This is just the beginning. There are ocular implants to help repair vision, and there are further in the future spinal implants, some of which have been tested to recover the use of limbs that have been harmed or disabled by spinal injuries. So that's the beginning of all this interfacing to our neural systems. I don't think we've got to the point where we can do, sense someone's thoughts. I mean, yes, there are people with hats that have a bunch of sensors on them, and you can sense the gross state of the brain and maybe distinguish 10, 11, or 12 different states. That's not the same as ESP, and I'm sort of doubtful we will get there. But Ray Kurzweil, who is a new employee at Google and who's written some pretty amazing books, including The Singularity is Near, in which he says that there's this exponential spiral of computing power coming, and eventually the computers will have more capability than all the neurons in our heads. And at that point, the machines will be designing other machines that are smarter than we are.
So a point where kind of artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence.
Yeah, that's his expectation is that at some point the machines will be smarter than all the people that ever lived because they'll keep inventing newer.
Do you believe that? And,
well,
and if yes, when? Is this like coming soon?
I'm still kind of skeptical about that extrapolation, but I can tell you that he has some really interesting ideas about how the cerebral cortex works. He sees it as a 6-layer stack of fairly regular pattern-matching cell forms that are able to either detect patterns or predict patterns that might be coming. And when I read his book, How to Create a Mind, and when we talk about the knowledge graph, which he's developing at Google, it's starting to sound like you could make a machine, even if it wasn't self-aware, could certainly become quite a strong partner in a conversation about content. So the reason he's working at Google is very simple. We're the only company in the world that has enough computing power to actually do what he wants to do. Now, what Ray wants, is to upload himself into a computer in the year 2029 so that he will live forever, and that way he can explore the galaxy.
What happens when a virus comes in?
I haven't asked him about that. We should, I don't know. Maybe he'll have an antivirus capability by that time.
Okay. Let me kind of end with a question, then open it up for you guys. Are you optimistic about the future? Where is all this going to take us?
Where is all this going to take us?
Are you optimistic about the future?
Look, this simple answer is one that Mark Weiser, who passed away at a young age, but he was at Xerox PARC and had this idea called ubiquitous computing. What he believed and what I believe is that computing and communication will become so ubiquitous, we will be wearing devices that can communicate and compute, that can keep track of our vital signs and how, the state of our bodies. There will be devices all around the house, in the office, in the car, or things we carry around. There'll be this continuum of computation and communication. We won't even think about it. Today we talk about and we think about the internet, but how many of us, except for the power generation companies, actually think about electricity? We don't. We just expect that it's there when you plug into the wall. There's this expression, technology is what you didn't grow up with. And internet, for a lot of kids that have been born in the last 20 years, is just there. And the ubiquitous computing and communications part will be just there for an awful lot of the population. But we'll assume it's there, we will rely on it, it will allow our homes and our offices and other appliances to adapt to our needs. And it won't seem strange to someone in the year 2063 to be having conversations with artificial intelligent machines and robots and other kinds of things. It just won't seem weird because it will have become the norm. And that's what I'm expecting. I'm sorry, I wish I was 8 years old because I'm really curious to see what's going to happen in 50 years. I just have to guess at it.
But maybe you'll upload yourself to the PC and still see it.
Well, that's, I will be surprised if that happens.
Okay, questions? Anyone? Wow, they're shy. This is very strange
shy
to see
or they're
an
shy or
Israeli
asleep,
shy audience. This is like a once in a lifetime. Yossi,
There's
yes.
one way there's one way in the back there.
Yeah.
Can we? Is it possible to turn the lights up? I don't know who has charge of the lights, but it'd be nice to see who. There we are. I hope you don't mind. Now you can discover each other too.
I'm gonna run with the microphone for folks so that you can.
All right.
I have a question about interfaces. I'm interested if your preferred interface is a keyboard or a touchscreen, and if you think touchscreens are the interface of the future or just the interface of today.
So this is a really interesting question because historically all we've done is type on keyboards, and the mouse has been with us for a while. I am convinced that we will discover alternative kinds of things. The speech interface is very important to us right now, but gestural interfaces are equally important. Microsoft has had a considerable amount of success using the Kinect, for example, in a variety of different ways. We are very much interested at Google in accessibility because there are people who have various impairments that don't make the normal interactions work well. I'm convinced that this is a space that's going to be important, especially for folks like me who are getting older. Our bodies were our friends for a long time, and then all of a sudden it's not our friend anymore. And so I'm looking, for some assistance. I'm persuaded that there will be the interfaces that we will use in the future will tend to be more like the way we communicate with each other. And I don't know whether that will extend to body language and things like that. But I think gestural communication, oral communication, and things like that will become much more the norm. So Yossi has a mic.
Okay, Vint, you described a period which was kind of idealistic, naive, for the sake of advancing technology, the 70s, the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. Then, during the last 15 years, big transformation happened to this industry. We see viruses, we see fraud, we see crime, we see pests, we see all kinds of things which I'm sure was not part of your vision, even though you dressed up with three-piece suit. Number one, what is your feeling about it? And number two, where do you see it's going?
I'm sorry, what was the second one? Where do you see it going? Oh, yeah, okay. So, well, thank you for calling it a vision and not a hallucination, by the way. I appreciate that. First of all, you remember that the first public use of the internet came in the late 1980s. We started to see publicly available networks around 1989 in the United States, and I don't know how quickly that got to either Israel or the rest of the world, but certainly in the 1990s. I believed at the time that it was very important for the general public to have access to this capability. I had hopes that they would not only use it, but contribute to it, and I think the World Wide Web example of all that content validated that expectation. On the other hand, I also realized, as did many of my colleagues, that when you put the general public onto a system like this, that you get all the good guys and the bad guys. So nothing that you see on the internet today that we all would perhaps agree is unacceptable, socially harmful, is different from non-internet harmfulness. It happens, and this is, by the way, doesn't mean we should ignore it. What it means is that we shouldn't be surprised that there are people in the world who don't have our best interest at heart. So the question, though, that you ask is what to do about that. I think there are only three kinds of responses to problems like this. One kind of response is to try to use technology to actually inhibit the bad behavior. So antivirus, for example, or Google's attempt to tell you don't go to that web page because we think there's a virus or a worm or a Trojan horse. Building more paranoid operating systems that are resistant to penetration. I tried to get the guys at Android to change the name of their of the operating system to Paranoid, but the marketing people thought that wasn't going to work. But we have to build smarter software that's more resistant to some of the penetration. So there are technical things we can do. We can use cryptography to improve privacy. We can use two-factor authentication to generate cryptographic passwords that only get used once. By the way, we use that at Google, and we make that available to the public, and I'm very proud of that. We can use digital signatures and things of that kind to avoid being misled in the domain name system by a poisoned router. So those are technical steps we can take. The next thing we can do is to adopt a kind of post-hoc enforcement. This is to say to people, if we catch you doing these things, and we've all agreed these are unacceptable, there will be consequences. Now, whether it's a legal consequence or a civil consequence or maybe a social consequence might vary. But the idea here is that if you detect, then you warn people that there will be a response. This doesn't mean you'll be able to detect every bad thing that happens. But this is also true in the real world. An example of this is drinking and driving. We tell people, don't drink and drive. If we catch you, we will put you in jail or take your license away or give you a fine. We know that there are people who do it anyway. But as a society, we conclude that we should say to people, don't do that, and if we catch you, there will be consequences. So there's a certain amount of inhibition introduced by that strategy. By the way, it's made a little more complicated by the fact that the perpetrator can be in one jurisdiction or one country and the victim in another, which suggests that there needs to be some international cooperation to cope with some of the abuses that occur in the system. Then there is a third way to approach this. These are not mutually exclusive. All three of them have to apply. And the third way is to use moral suasion by just telling people, don't do that. It's the wrong thing to do. And it sounds kind of wimpy, but honestly, when you get a large enough number of people who all agree that certain norms are preferable, it's kind of like gravity. It becomes very powerful in a large mass. So I think that we are at the point now where our technology has outrun our social intuition about the harms that can occur in the internet environment. So we do things that are unintentionally harmful. Everybody here has taken a picture, and probably many of you have uploaded the pictures to Google Plus or Facebook or Flickr or something else. Others have run through and tagged the names of the people that they see in the pictures. And the problem with this apparently innocent practice is that if the third party comes along looking for tagged names and finds a picture of you in a certain place and time, when you said you were someplace else, now you're either in an awkward position or you're embarrassed or worse. So, and each one of the steps was very innocent. So our intuitions about the social effects of the way we use this technology is still very immature. And I'm persuaded that we're going to have to live through a few painful moments. Can I remind you about what happened when Kodak invented the Brownie camera? This is like 1900, right? It's the first time you had a consumer-based camera that you could carry around, as opposed to a great big thing with, plate glass and, one of those exploding devices to highlight the picture. So what did people do with the Brownie cameras in 1900? They went to the beach and they took pictures of women wearing their bathing outfits. I don't know if you remember what the bathing outfits looked in 1900, but they were wearing more than some of you are wearing now. But it was considered an absolute outrage, and there were, headlines in the newspapers about this terrible abuse of the Brownie camera. Well, eventually we got through that, and people learned how to use the technology in a socially acceptable way. So I'm pretty persuaded that we will figure out how to do that, but it may take us a while to get there. So I think where we're headed is learning a lot more about the social intuition and social conventions for the use of the technology to make this sociologically acceptable.
Great. 2 more questions. Yankee, go ahead.
Thank you. As the father of the internet, I wonder what's your take on the Internet of Things, especially on the internet connecting us as human beings, maybe our organs, our body organs, maybe later in the future our individual cells. Once we are all connected to the internet internally and externally, What does it mean? What is the internet for us at that point?
So the one question is, are we about to make humans obsolete? Which, that's a pretty scary thought.
Or some kind of collective wisdom? Maybe that was another point?
Well,
no?
that's another possibility. Yeah, Homo sapiens 2.0. Yeah, the real question is it really Homo sapiens 2.0, or is it Homo something else, or is it, Deus ex machina? I wish that I had, deeper intuition here. I will say one thing has happened for sure. The amount of power and the physical size of devices that can sense, detect, and compute are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Nanotechnology is building stuff which, as you clearly imply, are at the cellular level. There already are devices that you can swallow that have radios in them that help figure out whether your intestinal tract is okay. There are devices that are really tiny cell-sized radios that could be seated inside the in the brain in order to send signals about neural function just far enough to get outside the outer layer of the brain and then be picked up and amplified by something else. So your question is actually very reasonable. It's not a crazy question at all. We've tended as a species to push the limits of things even if we don't know what the consequences are going to be. And it won't surprise me if we push the limits and there will be consequences that we didn't expect or intend that we will have to live with. We may very well evolve ourselves artificially to a different place, and it may be literally a different race. We've already kind of pushed the limits there with all of the things that Craig Venter is doing. I don't know whether any of you are following this, but he's building artificial DNA. And it's not necessarily to create artificial life. It's sometimes simply to create a process that maybe filters heavy metals out of something, or it selectively performs some transformation to turn waste into oil. But he's actually interested in building artificial life as well, which is really creepy, kind of scary. He's gotten part of the way there. The only thing I could say for sure is that anything that seems like science fiction now may someday turn into reality. Arthur Clarke, I think, had said it best. He said that any sufficiently advanced technology will seem like magic to to someone who doesn't know how it works.
That's great. Let's leave it with that. Vint, thanks you so much. It was fascinating. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience learned a lot as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.